Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson about project constraints, Part 1. This lesson covers the definitions of constraints and assumptions and how they're different, the traditional triple constraint, the newer model of the 6 constraints that is described in the PMBOK guide, as well as several examples of how to balance competing constraints, particularly in the face of proposed changes. Constraints and assumptions are not the same thing. They're very distinct concepts. A constraint is a limiting factor that affects the execution of a project. A constraint is a factor in the planning process that's considered to be true, real, or certain, but without proof or demonstration. Let's go through some examples. Examples of constraints include must-have features in a project, the fixed budget, the deadlines, which are often driven by market needs, specific quality standards that are requirements, limited physical resources, limited skill sets and availability of personnel to be on the project team, stakeholder risk tolerances, procurement limits such as approved vendor lists, government regulations, and even safety regulations. These are examples of constraints that limit your project. Examples of assumptions include resource availability, assumptions about facilities, equipment, computers, networks, and things like that, and when they'll be available, or how much they'll be available. Also, the acquisition of necessary permits and licenses, whether or not you'll be able to find and contract with outside vendors, the weather, the geology, pricing and materials of equipment, such as the cost of tires, exchange rates between different currencies, the economy, and even community support. These are all things that are assumptions that affect the planning process. Note, however, that both assumptions and constraints are recorded and managed in the assumption log, which is created as part of the Develop Project Charter process. The traditional triple constraint, sometimes referred to as the iron triangle or the project management triangle, has been around since at least the 1950s and includes scope, time, and cost. This triple constraint is typically represented by a triangle with scope, time, and cost along the edges, indicating the relationship that these have, and that if you make changes to one constraint or one side of the triangle, that you then need to make changes to the other sides of the triangle in order to compensate, or otherwise the quality of the project will suffer. Project managers that use the triple constraint will sometimes say, give me 2 of these edges and I'll give you the third. In other words, tell me the scope of what you want done and how long you have to do it, and I'll tell you what it'll cost. Or tell me what you want done and how much you want to spend, and I'll tell you how long it'll take. Or tell me how much budget you have and how much time you have, and I'll tell you how much can be done in that amount of time with that amount of budget. This relationship of the triple constraint can also be represented as a formula. Scope equals time plus cost. The analogy isn't perfect, but it's definitely useful. As a general rule, a certain scope of work is going to require a certain amount of time and money. If one of these is changed, then at least one of the other 2 needs to be changed in order to maintain the balance necessary to deliver the same quality of result. Although the triple constraint triangle is an excellent visual aid for communicating these interrelated constraints, the formula is actually more useful in measuring the impact of changes that are proposed. Let's take the case of an increase in scope. If your project sponsor approves a change request, and this change request requires more scope on the project, then according to this formula, time or cost or both need to increase. In the case of more scope, generally it'll be both cost and time that have to increase. It's going to cost more and it's going to take longer. In general, as a rough rule of thumb, more time and money on a project can buy more scope. For example, I once managed a project to develop a new system for a series of coal mines to manage the blending and shipping of coal. About halfway through the project, there was a change in the key users who were helping to specify the detailed requirements. And as a result of this change in stakeholders, they came up with a large list of changes in scope that were required, and this required more time and money to complete. On the other hand, let's suppose that your project sponsor comes to you and says that the project needs to be completed sooner than originally planned. One way to complete the project with the same scope, but sooner, is to use what we call crashing, which means adding more resources to the project. In this case, if you doubled the resources, you might think that you could cut the time in half and still spend about the same amount of money on the project. However, in general, adding twice as many resources doesn't quite cut the time in half. There are other factors involved in coordination and training, and there may be other factors in the schedule that prevent you from reducing it entirely to one half. So the end result is that although you've been able to reduce the amount of time on the project, it will probably cost a little bit more. In general, you can usually speed up a project by adding more resources, but it will cost a little bit more. Now suppose that you need to complete the project with less money, with a reduced budget. As you take a look at this formula, cost would be reduced, and in order to maintain this equation, either time has to go up or scope has to go down. Now, of course, reducing the amount of scope would result in a reduced cost. But what if you can't reduce the scope? What could you do to increase the time in order to keep this balanced? Well, one option would be to do crashing basically in reverse. Extend the amount of time by reducing the resources. If you choose to have fewer resources on the project and have it take longer, remember that just as in the previous example of costs being higher when you try to double the resources, if you have the resources, you may well be able to save some money. However, another approach that has more potential to reduce your costs is to find less expensive resources. You could do this by finding people that have lower skill levels, as long as those skill levels don't affect the quality but just cause the project to take longer, then that would be acceptable. You may also be able to find less expensive resources by being more flexible in your scheduling. This would make the project take longer, but by taking advantage of resources that would otherwise be more expensive and using them when they're available at lower rates, you could save yourself some money. Another option to reduce your resource expenses would be to outsource the work to other countries that have lower labor rates or lower taxes. However, be careful not to be deceived by the difference between labor rates and labor cost. Just because a certain resource costs less per hour doesn't mean it's going to cost less to get the job done. You may find someone who can get the job done for half the hourly rate, but if they take 4 times as long to finish it, you're not saving any money. Your costs are actually going up. This is a problem that was discovered by the auto manufacturing industry as they tried to outsource some of their auto manufacturing to other countries. They thought they'd be saving money, but it turns out that they actually increased their costs. Sometimes the higher skilled individuals or expert consultants can actually cost you less in the long run. As I said earlier, this idea of using a formula to represent the triple constraint is a good analogy, but it isn't always perfect. There are some times when you simply can't speed things up, or in some cases, slow them down. For example, it takes 9 months to have a baby. If you wanted to have a baby in 1 month, could you put 9 women on it? Of course not. Sometimes you're constrained by natural processes that can't feasibly be sped up or slowed down. For example, suppose you have an orchard of orange trees. If you double the number of trees in your orchard, then you can have twice as many oranges come harvest time. So you've increased the scope by increasing the cost. However, time is relatively fixed here. You can't simply increase or decrease the amount of time that it's going to take for the oranges to ripen. Even without natural constraints on a project and its time, there are other constraints that limit how much you can affect how long something will take. For example, if you double the number of people on the team, that isn't going to cut your time in half. In fact, because of the need for increased coordination and communication with a larger number of people, you're not going to be able to increase the speed of something as much as you might think. In fact, eventually adding more people to the team actually starts to slow things down rather than speed things up. This is because of the need for new people to be trained and for the additional coordination needed between team members. As stated famously by Brooks Law, adding manpower to a late software project makes it later. This principle that you can't just double the number of people on a project in order to cut the time in half was popularized in Frederick Brooks's The Mythical Man Month. If you try to push against some of these natural limits, there will be consequences, usually in quality or risk that you're taking. For example, suppose you want to finish a software development project earlier, and so you ask the team members to put in some overtime. So rather than putting in 40 hours a week, you ask them to put in 50. You might think that this would reduce the time it takes to complete the project. However, by having your team work longer hours, you increase the chances of them introducing quality problems, bugs into the system that could take you longer to resolve and fix, both in the short run and in the long run, than the time you think you're going to save. Or you may be able to finish the project a little faster, but you may have a lower quality product when all is said and done, and it may cost you more to maintain and enhance that product later. As you can see, quality is an important factor, and people have tried to include that in the triple constraint triangle by either putting quality on one of the edges and putting scope inside of the triangle, or by simply putting quality in the middle of the triangle. However, this doesn't quite work. Take, for example, putting scope in the middle. If you reduce the amount of time you have on the project, in other words, you reduce the length of that edge of the triangle, it's going to naturally reduce the amount of scope that you can accomplish in that time. That works. Also, if you reduce the budget so that this cost edge becomes smaller, that will also naturally reduce the scope. And that also fits with reality. However, it doesn't work when you start changing the quality edge. If you reduce the quality, it reduces the scope inside the triangle. And that's actually the opposite of reality. Because generally speaking, the more scope you try to tackle, the lower the quality. Now, if you take a look at the other triangle, in which quality is in the middle, if you have less time to work on the project and you reduce that one, then yes, quality will probably suffer if nothing else is changed. Or if you reduce the amount of money you have to spend on the project without changing anything else, yes, quality will suffer. But again, you have this problem that reducing the scope line doesn't reduce quality, it tends to increase it. So this triangle doesn't quite fit reality either. In both cases, these triple constraint triangles don't really adequately capture the relationship between scope and quality. Other adaptations of the project management triangle also include resources as a project constraint. Some have put it along with cost, and this does make some sense because you can consider money as well as physical resources and people to be grouped together as resources. However, usually it makes more sense to distinguish between resource constraints and the budget. If you combine them together, it's difficult to see how much of this constraint is the money in the budget and how much of the constraint is because of the physical resources or team members available. Still, we also have the problem of scope and quality being combined in this triangle here on the left. Because they're combined, it doesn't actually represent properly reality in that greater scope usually means lower quality if nothing else has changed. So some people will put quality in the middle in order to separate it from scope. But we still have this same problem we had with the other triangles. Increases in scope don't increase quality, they tend to decrease it if nothing else has changed. And we still have resources and cost grouped together. So neither of these two triangles adequately captures these relationships among all of these project constraints. More recently, the concept of project constraints has been expanded to include 6 constraints. These are scope, schedule, and cost, quality, of course, and resources, and also now risk as the 6th constraint. There can be others, but these are the main ones, and these are the ones that the PMBOK guide specifically calls out as the primary 6 constraints of a project. Now, we had enough trouble relating 3 or 4 constraints using the project management triangle. What do we do with 6? How can we relate these 6 project constraints in a way that is meaningful and useful? Although some people have tried to use 2 triangles on top of each other to try and capture these 6 constraints, I don't find that very useful or practical. However, this equation that represents this balance of the 6 constraints is very useful. Using this equation, you can see that scope and quality go together on one side of the equation, while cost, schedule, resources, and risk belong on the other side. Meaning that changes to scope, if scope were to increase, then either quality has to decrease to keep the balance, or something on the other side of this equation has to change. In the next several slides, we'll go through some specific examples of how this equation works to help balance the constraints of a project. And that's it for part 1. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.